The banker's daughter stood in the town square, with her hand resting on the arm of an Apache warrior, and the laughter cut through Prescott like a winter wind. Margaret Thornton had just announced her engagement to a man the townsfolk called a savage, a man whose people had been their enemies for generations. What none of them knew, what Margaret herself didn't know, was that the quiet Apache beside her carried a secret that would shake the foundations of their prejudice and transform her from the object of their mockery into something they never imagined possible. The afternoon sun beat down on the wooden boardwalks as shopkeepers stepped out of their stores to witness the spectacle. Women in their Sunday best clutched their parasols tighter, whispering behind gloved hands. Men spat tobacco juice into the dust and shook their heads in disgust. This was the girl who'd arrived from Boston 3 years earlier, refined and educated, the jewel of Prescott society. Now here she stood, publicly declaring her intention to marry an Indian. Her father had built the first bank of Prescott with his own hands and his own ambition. Charles Thornton was a man who measured everything in ledgers and profit margins, who believed the West could be tamed with enough capital and determination. Now he stood on his porch watching his only daughter walk away from everything he'd constructed. The shame burned in his chest like hot coals. He'd brought her west to find opportunity, to marry into one of the cattle dynasties or mining fortunes that were carving civilization from the wilderness. Instead, she chose Nahal, an Apache scout who worked for the cavalry, a man who owned nothing but a horse and the clothes on his back. The relationship had begun innocently enough. Nahal had been hired to guide a survey party through the mountains, and Margaret had joined the expedition to sketch the landscape. She'd always been artistic, filling notebooks with drawings of the desert flora and the dramatic rock formations that surrounded Prescott. During that 2-week journey, she'd watched Nahale move through the wilderness with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. He could read signs in the dirt that were invisible to everyone else, could predict weather by watching the behavior of birds, could find water in places that looked bone dry. They'd talked during rest stops, conversations that started with practical questions about the terrain and evolved into something deeper. Nahal spoke English perfectly, having learned it from missionaries as a child, but he also taught her words in his own language. She discovered that he had a subtle sense of humor, that he noticed details others missed, that he carried a profound sadness he rarely let show. By the time they returned to Prescott, something had shifted between them. The courtship had been conducted in secret at first. They'd meet at dawn near the river, walking together through the cottonwoods, while the town still slept. Nahal told her about his people's way of life before the reservations, about ceremonies and traditions that were being lost with each passing year. Margaret shared her own story, how her mother had died when she was 12, how her father had thrown himself into business to escape his grief, how she'd always felt like a chess piece in someone else's game. The wedding took place at dawn with no guests, just a circuit judge who owed Margaret's father enough favors to perform the ceremony without questions. The town stopped talking to her after that. Store owners served her in silence. Women who'd once invited her to tea crossed the street when they saw her coming. Her father sent one final letter, written in his careful banker's hand, telling her she was no longer his daughter and her name would be removed from his will. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. Margaret read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it in the bottom of her trunk. She didn't cry. She'd known this was coming, had prepared herself for the severing of that final tie. What hurt more than her father's rejection was the complete abandonment by everyone else. Friends who'd sworn eternal loyalty now pretended not to know her. The Presbyterian minister who'd welcomed her to his congregation suddenly found his schedule too full to receive visitors. Even the Mexican and Chinese families, who themselves faced discrimination, kept their distance, not wanting to be associated with someone who'd crossed an even more forbidden line. Margaret and Nahale built a small cabin in the foothills where the desert met the mountains, far enough from town to avoid the stairs, but close enough that she could still see the place she'd been banished from. The construction took 3 months. Nahale worked with an economy of movement that Margaret came to admire, never wasting effort, each log and stone placed with precision. She learned to mix adobe, to weave branches for the roof support, to think about buildings not as permanent structures, but as shelters that worked with the land rather than against it. She learned to cook over an open fire, to tan hides, to speak the Apache tongue with its flowing consonants and precise meanings. The language was harder than she'd expected, full of subtle tonal shifts that changed meanings entirely. But Nahale was patient, correcting her gently, laughing with her when she accidentally said something absurd. Nahale taught her which plants could heal and which could kill, how to read the sky for weather, how to move through the wilderness without leaving a trace. If you're listening to this story and finding yourself drawn into Margaret's world, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us what city or country you're tuning in from. Stories like these connect us across distance and time, reminding us that courage and love have no borders. The first year was the hardest. Margaret's hands, once soft and suited only for needlework and piano playing, developed blisters that became calluses. Her back ached from hauling water and gathering firewood. There were nights when she lay awake wondering if she'd made a catastrophic mistake, if love was really worth this much sacrifice. But then Nahal would reach for her hand in the darkness, or she'd wake to find him watching her with an expression of such tender wonder that her doubts would dissolve like morning mist. The years passed slowly at first, then faster. Margaret's hands grew calloused and strong. Her skin darkened under the relentless sun. The town below expanded, new buildings rising where there had been empty lots, new families arriving with their Eastern prejudices intact. Sometimes she'd ride down to buy supplies, and the silence that greeted her had evolved from hostile to merely cold. She existed in their world, but not of it, a ghost of the girl they'd once known. The general store owner, a man named Peterson who'd once courted her favor, now weighed her flour and sugar without meeting her eyes. The conversations in the store would stop when she entered, resume in hushed tones after she left. Children stared at her openly, having heard stories about the white woman who lived with Indians. Their mothers would pull them close, as if Margaret carried some contagion that might spread through proximity. Nahal worked as a scout and guide, leading cavalry patrols through Apache territory, translating between two worlds that refused to understand each other. He spoke little about his past, about the family he'd lost to disease and war, about the places his people once roamed freely. But at night, by the fire, he would tell Margaret stories of hidden canyons where water ran clear and cold, of sacred places where the old ones had left their marks on stone, of a time before the white men came with their hunger for gold and land. He was gone often, sometimes for weeks at a time. Margaret learned to manage alone, tending their small garden, maintaining the cabin, finding peace in solitude. She took up painting again, capturing the desert landscapes in watercolors, though she had no one to show them to. The isolation was nearly absolute. The only visitors were occasional Apache scouts who worked with Nahale, men who would share a meal and news from the reservations before disappearing back into the mountains. During one of Nahale's longer absences, Margaret rode into town and found it transformed by news of a silver strike in the nearby mountains. The streets teemed with prospectors and speculators, the saloons overflowed with men spending money they hadn't yet earned, and the air buzzed with the fever of potential wealth. She watched them, these men who'd come west chasing fortune, and felt a strange detachment. They measured value in ounces and veins, in claims and assays. She'd found something richer in her quiet cabin, in the man who taught her to see the world differently. Then, one morning in early spring, after 14 years of marriage, Nahal didn't wake up. His breathing had simply stopped during the night, his heart giving out without warning or struggle. Margaret found him peaceful, his face relaxed in a way she'd rarely seen during his waking hours. The grief hit her like a physical blow, doubling her over beside their bed. She'd given up everything for this man, and now he was gone, leaving her alone in a world that had already rejected her. She sat beside his body for hours, holding his hand as it grew cold, remembering every moment they'd shared. The first time he'd smiled at her, really smiled, not the polite expression he showed strangers, but something genuine and warm. The day he'd brought her wildflowers, awkward and uncertain if white women appreciated such gestures. The nights he'd held her through thunderstorms, knowing she still feared the violence of desert weather. 14 years had passed in what felt like moments, and now she faced a future without him. The funeral was small. A few Apache scouts came, men who'd worked alongside Nahale, their faces impassive as stone. They sang in their language, words Margaret understood now, songs about the journey to the spirit world and the reunions waiting there. The harmonies were haunting, older than the territory, older than the conflicts that had torn this land apart. They sang of warriors returning home, of spirits finding peace, of the continuity that transcended death. The town sent no one. Her father had died 2 years earlier, never having spoken to her again. She'd learned of his death from a newspaper notice, had felt a complicated grief for the relationship that could have been, but never was. She buried Nahale on a hill overlooking their cabin, marked his grave with stones she carried herself, each one placed with the care he'd taught her. She planted sage around the grave, knowing it was sacred to his people, and sat there until the stars emerged. 3 days after the funeral, a lawyer from Tucson appeared at her door. He was young, nervous, carrying a leather satchel that seemed too heavy for its size. His name was Samuel Chen, and his presence itself was unusual. Chinese lawyers were rare in Arizona territory, faces of discrimination themselves, which perhaps explained why Nahale had chosen him. He asked if she was Margaret Thornton, then corrected himself, Margaret Nahal. When she confirmed her identity, he asked if they could speak privately, as if the empty cabin weren't already the most private place imaginable. Samuel Chen opened his satchel with trembling hands and removed a stack of documents that would change everything she thought she knew. He laid them out on her rough wooden table, bank statements and property deeds, stock certificates and contracts, an archive of a secret life she'd never suspected. His voice was quiet as he began to explain, apologizing for the shock he was about to deliver. Nahale, it turned out, had been more than a scout and guide. The lawyer explained that 15 years earlier, before Margaret had even arrived in Arizona, Nahale had discovered a silver deposit while tracking renegades through the Dragoon Mountains. The vein was substantial, visible in an exposed cliff face after a rock slide, the kind of discovery that made men rich overnight. But Nahal knew that the courts would never honor an Apache's claim to mineral wealth. The laws were written to exclude his people from such opportunities, to ensure that no matter what they found or knew, the profits would flow to white men. Instead of filing a claim himself and watching it be stolen, Nahale had approached a Mexican businessman in Tucson named Rodrigo Salazar with a proposition. They would be silent partners. Salazar would file the claim, operate the mine, handle all the public-facing business, and they would split the profits. No one would know about Nahale's involvement. Salazar, himself familiar with the sting of discrimination, had agreed. They'd sealed the deal with a handshake and a contract witnessed by Samuel Chen's father, who'd been Salazar's lawyer. The mine had been producing steadily for over a decade. The Mexican partner had kept meticulous records, depositing Nahal's share into a bank account in Tucson every month without fail. The lawyer spread the bank statements across Margaret's rough wooden table. The numbers seemed impossible. Monthly deposits of hundreds of dollars, sometimes thousands during rich months. Nahal had accumulated a fortune that rivaled those of the cattle barons and mining magnates who'd always looked down on him. Margaret stared at the papers, unable to process what she was seeing. The man who'd shared her simple cabin, who'd mended his own clothes and repaired his own saddle, who'd never once mentioned wanting anything more than what they had been secretly wealthy beyond measure. All those trips he'd taken, the ones she'd assumed were scouting expeditions, some of them had been meetings with Salazar and Chen, managing investments and planning for a future he'd never told her about. But there was more. Samuel Chen continued, his voice gaining confidence as he walked her through the complexity of what Nahale had built. Nahale had been investing his money, buying property in Tucson and Phoenix under assumed names, purchasing shares in railroad companies and copper mines, acquiring land along routes he knew would become valuable as the territory developed. He'd used his knowledge of the terrain, his understanding of where water could be found and where rail lines would eventually run, to make strategic investments that had multiplied his wealth. The lawyer had spent weeks tracing all of Nahale's holdings, following a trail of shell companies and silent partnerships that stretched across the territory. The total value exceeded anything Margaret could have imagined. Conservative estimates put his estate at over $300,000, an amount that would be worth millions in future years. Her husband, the man the town had called a savage who owned nothing, had been quietly building an empire while living in a cabin without even glass windows. Samuel Chen handed her deed after deed, explaining each property and investment. A building in downtown Tucson that housed 3 successful businesses. A ranch in the San Pedro Valley with water rights and good grazing land. Shares in the Southern Pacific Railroad, a hotel in Phoenix, copper mining stocks that had doubled in value. Each revelation made the life she'd thought she knew seem more like an illusion. Margaret sat in silence as the lawyer continued. Everything had been left to her. Nahal had made a will, properly witnessed and notarized, leaving his entire estate to his wife. The lawyer handed her the will, and she recognized Nahale's careful signature at the bottom. Above it, in his precise handwriting, was a single sentence that brought tears to her eyes. She chose me when I had nothing, so everything I have is hers. But there was a second document, a letter written in Nahale's hand, dated just 3 months before his death. Samuel Chen handed it to her gently, suggesting she might want to read it in private. But Margaret opened it there, her hands shaking, desperate to hear her husband's voice one more time, even if only through written words. The letter explained everything. Nahal wrote that he'd kept his wealth secret, not from deception, but from love. He'd wanted to know that Margaret had chosen him for himself, not for what he could provide beyond their simple life together. He'd wanted their years together to be pure, untainted by the complications that money brought. He'd seen too many relationships corrupted by wealth, watched as gold fever destroyed families and friendships. In their cabin, they'd built something real, something that existed beyond transactions and social climbing. He wrote that he'd always planned to tell her, had rehearsed the conversation countless times. But each year that passed made the secret feel more precious somehow, this private knowledge that he could provide for her in ways she didn't expect. He'd been building a future for them, for children they'd hoped to have, but never did, for a day when they'd no longer be young and strong enough to live off the land. The letter ended with an apology and a promise. He was sorry for keeping secrets, but he hoped she'd understand that everything he'd done had been an act of love, a way of ensuring she'd be protected even after he was gone. Margaret wept then, deep shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. Samuel Chen quietly gathered the papers and stepped outside, giving her privacy for her grief. When she finally emerged an hour later, her eyes red but her jaw set with determination, she asked the lawyer to explain exactly what needed to be done. She had decisions to make. The transformation began slowly. Margaret didn't move back to Prescott immediately. Instead, she hired contractors from Tucson, men who didn't know her history and didn't care who she'd married. They expanded the cabin, adding rooms with real windows and wooden floors, building a barn and corrals. She bought cattle, good breeding stock from California, and hired men to work them. Most were Mexicans and a few Chinese, men who understood what it meant to be judged by appearance rather than character. She purchased the land surrounding her property, acre by acre, until she owned a substantial ranch. The cattle business gave her a legitimate reason to visit Prescott regularly, to conduct business with the very people who'd shunned her. She bought cattle, good breeding stock, and hired men to work them. She purchased the land surrounding her property, acre by acre, until she owned a substantial ranch. When she finally rode into Prescott 6 months later, she didn't come as a supplicant seeking acceptance. She came in a carriage pulled by matched horses, wearing a dress tailored in San Francisco, carrying documents that made her one of the largest landowners in the territory. The whispers started before she even stepped down from the carriage. Word had spread through the merchant networks about a mysterious cattle operation buying up prime rangeland, but no one had connected it to Margaret Nahale. The bank her father had founded was struggling, mismanaged by the men who'd taken over after his death. They'd made risky loans to friends and political allies, loans that had gone bad when silver prices dropped. The institution that Charles Thornton had built with such care was months away from insolvency. Margaret walked through its doors on a Tuesday morning and asked to speak with the board of directors. The meeting was tense. The 3 men on the board recognized her immediately, though they tried to hide their discomfort behind professional courtesy. She'd prepared her presentation carefully, working with Samuel Chen to ensure every detail was perfect. She laid out the bank's problems with brutal clarity, showed them exactly how their mismanagement had brought the institution to the brink of failure. Then she made her offer. She would buy the bank outright, paying cash, on the condition that she had complete control of operations. The board members exchanged glances, clearly torn between their need for capital and their horror at being saved by a woman who'd married an Apache. But numbers don't lie, and Margaret's offer was more than fair. It was also their only option. They accepted, signed the papers that afternoon, and walked out of the building they'd controlled for years, defeated by the woman they'd once dismissed. The same women who'd crossed the street to avoid her now sought invitations to her home. The men who'd laughed at her wedding now tipped their hats and called her Mom. She was polite to them all, courteous even, but she never forgot. She remembered every slight, every turned back, every whispered insult. She didn't seek revenge, but she didn't forgive either. She simply moved forward, using her position to reshape Prescott in ways that would have horrified its founding fathers. She used her wealth strategically, supporting businesses owned by Mexicans and Chinese immigrants, hiring Apache scouts and guides at fair wages, quietly funding a school that accepted children regardless of race. When the Presbyterian church that had rejected her announced plans to build a new sanctuary, she outbid them for the property they'd selected and donated it to a Catholic mission that welcomed everyone. When the town council proposed an ordinance restricting where Chinese merchants could operate, she bought the buildings they were being forced to vacate and lowered the rents, making it economically impossible to enforce the law. Years passed. Margaret became a fixture in Arizona society, known for her business acumen and her strange insistence on treating everyone equally. Newspapers from as far as San Francisco wrote about her, the mysterious widow who'd transformed from social pariah to territorial power broker. She was invited to speak at women's clubs, though she usually declined. She had no interest in being a symbol or a curiosity. She simply went about the work of building what Nahale had started. The ranch prospered, becoming known for quality cattle and fair treatment of workers. The bank stabilized under her management, then grew, opening branches in Phoenix and Tucson. She invested in the territory's future, backing railroad extensions and irrigation projects, supporting the development of schools and hospitals. She never remarried. The cabin in the foothills remained her true home, the place she returned to when the social obligations of town became too much. She kept Nahale's grave tended, bringing fresh flowers when they were available, sitting beside the stones to tell him about the changes his hidden fortune had made possible. Sometimes she'd bring her account books and read him the numbers, imagining what he'd think of how she'd multiplied his investment. Other times she'd just sit in silence, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple, feeling his presence in the wind that whispered through the sage. Margaret hired Apache guides for her ranching operations, paying them the same wages she paid white cowboys, providing them with quality horses and equipment. She employed Chinese cooks and Mexican vaqueros, creating a workforce that reflected the actual diversity of the territory rather than the narrow vision of Prescott's founders. Her ranch became known as a place where a man's skill mattered more than his ancestry, where hard work was rewarded regardless of the color of one's skin. The school she funded grew from a one-room building into a proper institution with multiple teachers and a curriculum that included Apache, Spanish, and English language instruction. The town leaders grumbled about it, claimed she was wasting money on children who'd never amount to anything, but Margaret had learned patience from Nahale. She didn't argue with them. She just kept writing checks and hiring teachers, knowing that education was an investment that would pay dividends long after she was gone. On her 70th birthday, Margaret made an announcement that shocked Prescott one final time. She gathered the town's leaders, business owners, and prominent citizens in the bank's main hall. They came expecting some business announcement, perhaps news of another expansion or investment. Instead, Margaret stood before them and announced she was donating the majority of her estate to create a foundation that would provide education and business opportunities for Native Americans throughout the territory. The foundation would bear Nahale's name, ensuring that the man they'd called a savage would be remembered long after they were all dust. It would fund scholarships for Apache students to attend universities, provide loans for Native Americans to start businesses, and support the preservation of tribal languages and traditions. The endowment was substantial enough to continue in perpetuity, a permanent reminder of who Nahale had really been. The room fell silent. Some faces showed genuine shock, others barely concealed disgust. A cattle baron named Harrison, a man who'd once courted Margaret before she'd met Nahale, stood up and walked out without a word. Others followed, but some stayed, and a few even approached her afterward with quiet words of respect. The territory was changing, slowly, and Margaret was helping to shape that change whether people wanted it or not. The old-timers who remained, the ones who'd laughed at that wedding decades earlier, finally understood what Margaret had known all along. Nahale had been richer than any of them, not just in silver and land, but in dignity, wisdom, and the quiet strength to build something lasting without needing anyone's approval. He'd chosen to live simply, to work humbly, measuring his wealth not by what he displayed, but by what he could give to the woman who'd chosen him. Margaret spent her final years traveling between the ranch, the bank, and the foundation offices, ensuring everything was properly structured to continue after her death. She commissioned a detailed history of Nahale's life, hiring a writer to interview the scouts who'd known him, to document his achievements and his character. The book was published a year before she died, distributed to libraries and schools throughout the territory, a permanent record that contradicted every stereotype the town had held. She also wrote her own memoir, though it wouldn't be published until after her death per her instructions. In it, she detailed the 14 years she'd spent with Nahale, the lessons he'd taught her, the world he'd shown her. She wrote honestly about the prejudice they'd faced, naming names and documenting incidents, creating a historical record that couldn't be whitewashed or forgotten. But she also wrote about love, about the quiet dignity of a man who'd been more than anyone gave him credit for, about the choice she'd made and never regretted. Margaret died in her sleep at 76, in the cabin where she'd lived with Nahale, surrounded by the life they'd built together. Her housekeeper found her in the morning, peaceful, a slight smile on her face. On the bedside table was a photograph of Nahale, taken during their early years together, his face solemn, but his eyes showing the warmth he rarely let others see. They buried her beside him on that hill overlooking the valley. The funeral drew hundreds, Apache and white, Mexican and Chinese, rich and poor. They came to honor a woman who taught them that courage meant choosing love over comfort, and that true wealth was measured in things that couldn't be counted or displayed. The Apache scouts sang their songs again, the same haunting melodies they'd sung for Nahale, welcoming another spirit home. Samuel Chen gave the eulogy, speaking of a woman who'd transformed grief into purpose, who'd used unexpected wealth not for personal comfort, but for justice and opportunity. He spoke of how she'd honored Nahale's memory, not with monuments or empty gestures, but by finishing the work he'd started, by using his fortune to change the territory in ways he'd never been allowed to do himself. The foundation still exists, bearing Nahale's name, funding scholarships and business grants across the Southwest. It's helped thousands of Native American students attend college, supported hundreds of tribal businesses, preserved languages that were on the brink of extinction. The annual report is distributed each year on the anniversary of Margaret and Nahale's wedding, a deliberate choice made by the Foundation's board to commemorate the day that changed everything. And sometimes, people say, on quiet evenings in the foothills, you can see two figures walking together through the pinyon pines, a woman and a man, finally free from the judgment of those who never understood that the greatest fortune isn't found in the ground or stored in vaults, but in the simple act of choosing wisely when everyone else is laughing at your choice. The ranch still operates, now owned by a partnership that includes descendants of the original Apache scouts, Mexican vaqueros, and Chinese immigrants who worked there. The bank Margaret saved is now part of a larger financial institution, but a plaque in the lobby tells her story and Nahale's, reminding customers that the building they're standing in was saved by an Apache's fortune managed by a woman the town had rejected. The town that mocked their union eventually faded, its buildings crumbling back into the desert. But what Nahale and Margaret built together endures, a testament to a love that transformed ridicule into legacy, and proved that sometimes the people we dismiss as having nothing are actually richer than we could ever imagine. Their story is taught in schools now, a reminder that prejudice is not just morally wrong, but often blinds us to the truth standing right in front of us, that the measure of a person has nothing to do with the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth, and everything to do with the content of their character and the quiet dignity with which they move through the world.